So before we fully start the session, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to acknowledge the extremely tragic recent discovery made by Tecumloops Te Sequahim Nation. We would like to extend support to those who are most affected by this traumatic news. We'd also like to advocate for immediate implementation of the TRC's calls to action, particularly by government and Catholic Church entities. We'd also like to extend support to colleagues and friends who are impacted and those who are working to assist survivors of the residential school system in Canada. If you or someone you know have been affected by the residential school system, support is available. There's 2 phone numbers that we've included here. And additionally, at the bottom of the slide, included a link provided by Tecumloops Te Sequahim with advice specifically for how to support their nation at this time. And as we come together virtually around the world, I'd like to encourage everyone to acknowledge the traditional and ancestral territory where you're joining us from today. See that some folks are already starting to do so in the chat. I am joining today from Sambaki Denende on Chief Dragi's territory. This is the traditional territory of the Yellowknives Dene, and colonially known as Yellowknife Northwest Territories. I've moved here very recently. I'm a white settler who moved here just this past January after spending many years in Tkaronto, and I grew up on Nipmuc and Pennacook lands in the state currently known as Massachusetts. So again, feel free to add your own introductions and acknowledgements in the chat. If you're not sure whose territory you're on or the treaties that govern relationship to these lands, you can check out whose.land. It's a really great resource that's been tailored to the Canadian context. And so we're going to be hearing from 3 presenters today. The first one is Amanda Grzyb. She is Associate Professor of Information and Media Studies at Western University, where her primary teaching and research interests include state violence, genocide studies, media and the public interest, social movements, and memory studies. Her articles, book chapters, public reports, and research creation projects focus on El Salvador, Honduras, Nazi-occupied Europe, Rwanda, and Sudan. Dr. Grzyb currently serves as the project director for Surviving Memory in Postwar El Salvador. This is a SSHRC-funded international interdisciplinary community-based research initiative that is committed to documenting the history of the Salvadoran Civil War and to preventing future violence. She completed her PhD in English at Duke University in 2007. And the second speaker that we'll be hearing from is Jen Castro, who is the Applied Technologies Manager in the Programs team at Digital Democracy, who's co-developing Mapeo with land-based communities predominantly in the Amazon. And in Canada, this has meant proactively considering the possibilities and collaborating with developers to ensure that Mapeo can be useful to Indigenous communities here as well. Jen's work is grounded in active investigation of how industry, migration, displacement, and social constructs intersect and impact both communities and individuals. Her interest is in recentering projects to uphold dignity and traditional ways of being in communities whose rich cultures and histories are generally overlooked or imposed on by uninvited external forces. And lastly, we'll be hearing from Yvonne Ng, who is the Archives Program Manager at Witness, where she trains and supports partners on collecting, managing, and preserving video documentation for human rights advocacy and evidence. She also develops training resources related to archiving and preservation. Prior to joining Witness in 2009, Yvonne worked as a research fellow on the Preserving Digital Public Television project and at NYU Libraries, New York Public Library, and the Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Center. Yvonne holds an MA in Moving Image Archiving and Preservation from New York University, as well as a BA in Cinema Studies from the University of Toronto. Yvonne formerly served on the board of directors for the Association of Moving Image Archivists and on the advisory board of Documenting the Now, and is currently an advisor for the Memory Lab Network and Open Archive. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Amanda.
Okay, thanks so much, Renee. Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias a todos y todas. I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Lenape-Wak, Anishinaabe, Attawandaron, and Haudenosaunee peoples on lands that are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. And as a scholar whose research focuses on the history of genocide and state violence, it's also important for me to recognize both the historical and contemporary forms of genocidal violence perpetrated against Indigenous people by the Canadian state through both its repressive and ideological apparatuses. I also want to acknowledge, for the purposes of this presentation, the history of colonial and post-colonial genocidal violence in El Salvador, including the 1932 massacre of Indigenous people that's known regionally as La Matanza. The Surviving Memory in Postwar El Salvador Collaborative Research Initiative is a transnational partnership of survivors, scholars, artists, lawyers, archivists, museums, architects, engineers, community organizers, municipal governments, civil society organizations, and mental health professionals who are committed to documenting the history of the Salvadorian Civil War from 1980 to 1992, and also to preventing future violence. During their investigation in 1993, the United Nations Commission on the Truth for El Salvador received 22,000 complaints of serious acts of violence, 85% of which they attributed to the US-backed Salvadorian government army. Our team works in solidarity with war-affected communities to realize the still neglected recommendations of the Truth Commission, including documentation, memorialization, restorative justice, and reconciliation. We have a very large team, including 22 partners and more than 60 collaborators, co-applicants, students, and trainees, who are working on diverse projects in partnership with Salvadorian communities and the Salvadorian Canadian diaspora. You can see many of the logos of our partners here. They include 8 Salvadorian civil society organizations and prominent leaders of the Salvadorian social movement, 6 universities, 2 Salvadorian museums, 4 Canadian nonprofits, 1 private architecture firm in Belgium, and quite significantly, 5 Salvadorian municipalities that are located in the departments of Chalatenango and Cuscatlán. Over the last 4 years, we have identified 8 core themes that define our historical memory research with communities. These include environmental reparation, mental health and healing, commemoration, art, music, and theater, documentation and testimonies, justice, intergenerational education, and local economic reconstruction. And it's important to note that our team is not exploring these themes in silos, but rather we're really interested in how they intersect with one another. So, for example, the relationship between documentation and testimonies, intergenerational education, and mental health and healing in communities. Our governance model is horizontal and collaborative and non-hierarchical, and we use consensus-based decision-making processes, which is supported by frequent community meetings, consultations, and general assemblies. And this governance model is really imperative to the success of our collaborative work. We've been really fortunate to receive 2 SURE grants that have allowed our international team members to build strong relationships with Salvadorian community partners through a series of pilot projects from 2016 to 2021. And although the news is still under embargo, we recently were notified that our team was successful in 2 linked grant competitions that will provide us with an additional $5.5 million in research funding over the next 7 years. And this is going to greatly increase the scale and scope and capacity of our work. I want to provide you with just a quick overview of our community-based initiatives, and I look forward to diving deeper into some of these projects during the discussion period and through the Q&A. So our projects include pop-up photo exhibitions in repopulated rural communities in El Salvador that consist of amateur photographs of the Salvadorian refugee camps taken by aid workers, peace delegates, and politicians, as well as 80 children's drawings from Mesa Grande refugee camp that were collected by a Canadian woman named Linda Dale. We also run frequent historical memory workshops. These are intergenerational sharing workshops and also capacity building workshops that include community training and preservation, filmmaking, podcasting, map making, art workshops, and also grant writing. We are co-creating an interactive music archive and also co-creating community history books in collaboration with the Museum of the Word and Image in San Salvador. And here you see pictured our recent publication, Memoria Viva, which is a community history book about refugee experiences in Mesa Grande and La Virtud. We co-produce documentary films as well as hundreds of video and audio testimonies. And we also engage in the holistic integration of mental health interventions into our work, which is based on community needs assessments and led by Salvadorian mental health experts. We co-create interactive maps of massacres, and this is a process that involves hiking to remote massacre sites with survivors, obtaining precise GPS coordinates for mass graves and massacre locations, and then recording testimonies either at the site or at other locations. We organize community commemoration events and local knowledge exchange activities. We engage in the architectural co-design of memorials and historical memory routes through war-affected communities. And here I want to highlight one of our most significant and successful pilot projects, which is the co-design and co-creation of the Sampul Massacre Memorial Park at Las Aradas. And this commemorates the second largest massacre of civilians during the Civil War. And I will kind of swing back to this example at the very end of the presentation. We engage in community-based historical memory art projects, including the co-creation of murals, sculptures, soundscapes, and ceramic installations. We are engaging in a new initiative that's focused on the recovery and documentation of traditional knowledge of foods, medicines, and materials that was radically disrupted during the Civil War. We're engaged in the repatriation, digitization, and preservation of photos, documents, videos, and material objects of memory, both in international and local collections. And finally, all of these projects that I briefly described will contribute to the development of 2 local historical memory museums in the municipalities of Las Vueltas and Arquitao, and also the Salvadorian Canadian Association's Virtual Museum of Salvadorian Migration to Canada. In every one of our projects, our team employs collaborative, community-based, and participatory methodologies. We work in interdisciplinary, transnational, and cross-sectoral teams to develop research documentation and preservation priorities from the bottom up. So for example, a research team could consist of a massacre survivor, a psychiatrist, an artist, an anthropologist, an environmental activist, and a youth leader, all working together to develop and execute a project. We always ensure that our projects meet the needs of Salvadorian communities as defined by those community members. And workshops really are the backbone of our collaborative work. This allows us the space to build relationships, develop research, and amplify the voices of survivors and other local actors. We're always committed to co-authorship and co-creation, and we work to resist more traditional extractive modes of research. The creation of community-owned archives in El Salvador is central to the next phase of our partnership project and is woven throughout our various initiatives. In addition to repatriating photos and documents from abroad, we are working with several Salvadorian civil society organizations and municipalities to organize, digitize, and preserve their collections, which are often stored in boxes, cabinets, or sheds that are highly vulnerable to humidity and water damage in a region that is really prone to earthquakes and hurricanes. And in keeping with our methodology, we are going to launch this work, archival work, in the fall with virtual and eventually in-person training workshops organized and designed by Western Librarians Archivist Amanda Oliver, in which youth, local leaders, and community historians will learn how to inventory, organize, digitize, and preserve their local collections. These archives will be owned by local communities and organizations, and we will work with all of our partners to devise ways to make these materials publicly accessible through archives, exhibitions, digital platforms, memory trails, education guides, phone apps, videos, interactive maps, social media, and community books. And we'll continue to fortify these community memory projects through the documentation of oral histories, testimonies, and sites of memory that are embedded into the Salvadorian landscape. Our new oral history and documentation labs located at Western University and in San Jose Las Flores, Chalatenango in El Salvador will be really central to this effort. The lab includes professional cameras, really easy to use GoPro cameras, a drone, GPS equipment, computer workstations, podcast kits, and field recording kits that will be accessible both to our core research team and also to members of our partner communities. We're really excited about all of these new initiatives, and I invite any feedback or suggestions from you during the discussion period about how we can best realize these future projects. We're really at the beginning stages with the next phases of our project, and we're looking for lots of feedback around best practices and accessibility. I want to close the presentation with a 1-minute video to share some words from Felipe Tobar. Felipe is a SHIRT collaborator, survivor, community leader, and former mayor in San Jose Las Flores. And although he is talking here specifically about the importance of the Sampo Massacre Memorial Park project, his insights also reflect on the importance of documentation and commemoration projects for Salvadorian communities, particularly survivors of mass violence. And I'm just going to, reshare because I'm not sure that I shared my sound.
Para mí tiene un significado de compromiso histórico con los sobrevivientes. Primero, desde el principio nosotros hemos sido como los que hemos representado a la gente sobreviviente. Entonces ellos, primer petición que nos pidieron que compráramos el terreno. Entonces nosotros hemos organizado la gestión, las recolectas a nivel de las comunidades y con diferentes instituciones para comprar el terreno. Cuando ya compramos el terreno, hoy la misma población nos ha dicho que debemos de hacer un parque memorial bonito ahí que recuerde a los niños y niñas y mujeres, ancianos que murieron allí. Entonces por eso hemos sembrado a principio los árboles. Esos árboles van a tener vida con flores rojas, simbolizando la sangre que la gente derramó allí injustamente. Así es que para mí ese es el compromiso que tenemos con la asociación, escuchando a la gente. ¿Qué menos podemos hacer? Representarlos y trabajar para que ese lugar sea un lugar santo, bonito, que le guste a la gente y que sientan los sobrevivientes que murieron ahí, bueno, sus familiares que murieron ahí, que tiene vida. Sí. Para mí eso es importante, signo de vida. Recordar a los caídos no es recordar a los muertos, es recordar a la gente cómo era en vida y para mí eso simboliza mucho.
Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. Thanks so much for listening and looking forward to the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Amanda. Now we'll turn it over to Jen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jen Castro. I'm a second-generation migrant from Ecuador by way of Toronto and Vancouver. Currently living on Montreal or Tiohtià:ke, where I've been living for the last year and have a lot to learn still. I know that the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized custodians of the lands and waters here, but I also know that Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people have known and used this territory throughout history. I asked my friend John Fournier, a toponymist and unceded Algonquin territory, if he knew what the Anishinaabewin place name for Montreal was. He sent me a few different versions of Moniag. Sorry about the pronunciation, still learning. And that's a post-colonial adaptation of the word Montreal. He also said that there was records from the Jesuits of Minintik, Umintik, and Tegovan. Again, sorry about the pronunciation, but their translation roughly is the island where there was a village before. I imagine that there would have been a whole generation of elders who would have been the human archives of this information if there were no Indian residential schools. So the first time I understood the gravity of bad information I had received from my schooling in Canada and mass media, I guess, was in 2011. I was in the unceded territories of the Musqueam Squaw Nation, Tsleil-Waututh Nation, known as Vancouver. I was 30 years old and I'd never heard of a residential school before. I was learning at that point directly from urban Indigenous survivors in the downtown east side of Vancouver about their traumatic estrangement from their languages, their families, their home territories, and for many of them, their dignity. What I realize now is it was a really unique privilege that I had to access this important and primary information. Since then, I've recognized that the millennia-old living collaborative archives of knowledge and experiences of Indigenous people on Turtle Island live in the actual people. And yeah, I just wanted to do a quick share. Can everyone see that okay? Great. So because of this history, Indigenous people in Canada especially have been really innovating the use and development of technology in unique ways because the experience of colonization has radically affected their traditional archiving structures and practices of intergenerational knowledge sharing. This here is an example of one of many projects, nativeland.ca, and it's really just transforming concepts of verification and publication and privacy of information or public information, all really important things to consider. So about the organization, Digital Democracy. We are a not-for-profit org based in the USA. Our mission is to empower marginalized communities to use technology to defend their rights. We have a couple core values that keep us centered: self-determination and autonomy, accessibility, collaboration, and social and environmental justice. What we do at this point, we do technical tool development, which I'll get into. We do technical accompaniment, which is often what we do in the field. You can see here in the photos below, different members of the team visiting communities in Ecuador and Peru. And we also do community engagement in spaces like these, but also digital community engagement for some of the open source tools that we develop. There you see a screen capture of GitHub. Who we work with. So first and foremost, we go where we're invited. These are the people who have heard about some of the work we've done and have asked for our accompaniment. Right now, our partners are primarily Indigenous communities, and they're local organizing allies, and are often doing land-based data collection for the protection, conservation, and demarcation of the traditional territories. Many of them are in the Amazon right now, and new partnerships have launched with communities in Africa, Southeast Asia, and also Turtle Island. Our partners are our primary collaborators on the technology we develop and also the methodologies. And if there were already tools that worked for them, we wouldn't have actually started a software development branch of our organization. So it's really because of our partners that we are developing some pretty special tools I'll talk about in detail. So first of all, where they work. So our tools are meant to address their particular needs. They're often living in forested or deforested remote areas with limited or no telecom or electricity infrastructure. And obviously, because of that, there is very limited or no internet. For some groups, it can take a few days to take a boat to a place that has internet or communication capacity. They're also, you can see by the images here, they're working in pretty grave situations. Above, you'll see a mining site in southern Peru. Below, you'll see a oil spill site in northern Peru, where they've been dealing with contaminated groundwaters for decades. And here also in this protected area, you'll see the extremely lush and dense forest, which is being protected right now by organizations that are working there that are indigenous. So because of where they work, they have some pretty unique challenges of offline data management. You know, some of the best offline data management is actually paper. You'll see here a drawn map of Guarani territory. And you'll also see up on the top right, one of the local mapping team technicians is learning to use QGIS to try to see if he can translate the drawn map into a printed map. That ended up being quite difficult. And so we ended up responding with the tool development of Mapeo. And you can see a big other paper map here that was the result of mapping work with Mapeo. There's also, of course, GPS devices and notebooks, but obviously the best offline archives is human memory and community knowledge that is transmitted from person to person, community to community, and generation to generation. So let's talk about Mapeo. We have designed a tool that's responding to really specific use cases. So because they're remote communities, we wanted to make sure that data could be viewed offline. There's tools like ODK Collect that do collect data and can submit later on, but they won't be able to see the data in this space. So that wasn't working for a lot of partners. We also want to combat data extractivism, which is terribly common. Mapeo is one of the ways that we can support our partners having data stay in their communities. And as I mentioned, there is no or poor internet access, so sharing digital databases becomes challenging, which is why we've been working on a data sharing process called peer-to-peer. And of course, there's also mixed levels of digital literacy. So we'll have users who may or may not have gone to school, may or may not even know the dominant language in the country, Spanish, and they might have to be speaking 2 or 3 other indigenous languages. And so the technical interfaces of typical tools aren't accessible to them. And so we've designed Mapeo to be quite user-centered in design and address some of those particular issues. And also there's just like a lot of unique data stories that communities want to document. So Mapeo's structure is such that a community project can be quite customizable in terms of information design through the use of configurations. Here you can see a couple screen captures. There's a Mapeo mobile app, which is used to capture some basic GIS information, some photos that accompany with it. And you'll see Mapeo desktop, which can also manage some of that data being collected, but also has a territory mapping tool, which is quite powerful. Did I mention it was open source? That's the best part. So anyways, I'll get into this really particular detail. So what information is actually stored in Mapeo? So there are some essential bits of data, the coordinates, because it's a GIS tool, and all the metadata behind that is recaptured inside. The time it was saved, which is kind of a strange thing to I underline, but that does affect some of the behind the scenes management of data information on edits. So it's a really particular important thing to note. And also a category ID. which is a customizable category. For a user, what that means would be like the icon on a map or a legend. Sorry. There are some options to add details, and it's the log system that is actually the unique part of the tool, because it's the information structure is not really defined by an external force of section of parameters, but actually individual packets of data and the log that kind of just basically creates a directory of what information is included. So how do those decentralized devices share a database? Through web synchronization. So this is something that can be done through Wi-Fi or through a USB stick if you have a computer. And here's the super fun part: synchronization peer-to-peer. So this is some video of some devices that have independent databases that are collecting data. They will use a Wi-Fi router to synchronize information with each other. And it'll sync basically all the information that they have in this database with each other. It's also really particular that it'll only synchronize new information. So if there's repeat information, it doesn't need to pass over that information, it'll only pass the new stuff. You can see on the bottom left, there's one person who didn't get to synchronize. And so for them to be able to have equivalent data in the ecosystem, they can actually synchronize with any one of the other peers in order to have the same database information in its context. So let's get more complicated. This is a much bigger ecosystem, but we'll see kind of the first 3 synchronizations happen between people who are just kind of close to each other. So you'll again see data syncing from device to device. It'll aggregate as it passes from group to group. And this is kind of what I call the chaos model, or the unstrategically enthusiastic syncing model, where people just kind of bump into each other and say, hey, we haven't synced before. Let's work together and add some data. But you can see that in this model, there's an inequivalent distribution of information. You can see on this bottom left, this person only synced once early and on, so they didn't actually have access to this information that, let's say, these folks in the middle did. So really, Mapeo is inviting a little bit more strategic thinking around data distribution. So this is what I call the pod model, where similarly, again, devices or people will collect the data independently. They will meet up and sync with each other to help distribute the data amongst each other. And in this particular case, this group has thought to actually pick the green devices to be the networkers. And so the green folks will meet up and they'll sync all of their data across each other's pods, and then go back to their pod to redistribute the data. So even though there was less synchronizations that happened throughout that whole process, it was actually a really helpful way to think through what is the best way to make all the data equivalent across the databases. Which means that communities get to determine how they organize themselves and have a lot more autonomy around, let's say, the hierarchy of information or distribution of data. In the Alianza Sabo case, they used their territory mapping to, in a way, from community to community, using a small team that rotated through areas, and they won a landmark case. With Northern Peru, with oil spill monitoring, they've been able to really advance their local knowledge and upkeep accurate records of all the spills that have been not properly taken care of. And in the Americaeri Reserve, they've been able to use that data to collaborate directly with the conservationist groups there and actually share the data in a way that they have a lot of control over. I have a bunch of final thoughts, but I think my time is wrapping, so I'll save some of these questions for later, but just like open-ended questions around what it means to add different kinds of data formats, ways that we need to adapt, and really looking forward to the Q&A.
Right. Incredible. Thank you so much, Jen. And yeah, we're going to turn it over to Yvonne.
Thank you, Renee. And also thank you, Grant, for organizing this panel. I'm really humbled to be here with Jen and Amanda and all of you who've joined today. So as Renee mentioned at the beginning, my name is Yvonne Ng. I manage the Archives program at Witness, and I live in Prague in the Czech Republic. And I apologize, I did not prepare a land acknowledgement because I don't know what the appropriate way to do that is in the context of Europe, just given the history of how we understand this idea of indigeneity in relation to European colonialism. But I would like to just express my deep respect and awe for the work that activists and indigenous communities globally are doing to defend their lands and demand their rights. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, am I presenting to you all right now? Today I'd like to share with you a bit about what we do at Witness and the approach we took to collaborative archiving through partnerships with 2 community-based organizations in the United States in support of their work on police accountability. So for those of you who are not familiar, Witness is a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1992, and our mission is to help people to use video and technology to protect and defend human rights. And we're not a huge team, but we work globally. Our programs are structured by region. So we have programs in the United States, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, Brazil, Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia Pacific. We also have subject area programs, including videos evidence, technology, and archives, which is the program that I work in. And in recent years, our work has focused broadly on the areas of land defense, state violence, and serious international crimes. So before I share the 2 collaborative archiving projects with you, I wanted to just sort of share with you what our overarching model looks like of how we work. And so it's sort of what we call our theory of change. So that first quadrant on the top left there, listening and anticipating. So this is sort of about asking how we as Witness can help human rights defenders use video more safely and effectively. And so this is kind of the ongoing work we do in outreach, building trusted relationships and networks, organizing trainings and convenings to bring activists together. The second quadrant is collaborating for impact. And so once we've identified a gap in the use of video and the possibility of our involvement having an impact, we work together with local leading activists to help them achieve their advocacy goals and to build their capacity. So these are, for example, our multi-year project partnerships where we work very closely one-on-one with a partner on a project. The third quadrant, learning and sharing, is how we scale the work that we're doing to reach a wider audience of people who are using video for human rights. So for example, we might work with a partner to create documentation or learnings from our project that then can be shared with others as written resources, as webinars, as trainings, etc. And then the final bucket, systems change, is another way that we work to have broad-based impact. So systems change is the work we do to apply our learnings to advocate for system level changes, such as with technology platform providers that we all rely on and activists rely on. So for example, we work on issues like content moderation, misinformation, and authenticity infrastructure. So with this model in mind, I'd now like to talk about a couple of a multi-year project on police accountability and documenting police misconduct that involved collaborative archiving with 2 local partners in the US. So starting in 2015, following the police killings of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, we began to investigate the role that video documentation of police abuse can have in bringing accountability in advocacy and in legal settings, and trying to understand how we could have the most impact in supporting communities experiencing and documenting police violence. Through our media lab, we published a project called Caught on Camera: Police Abuse in the US that included case studies on the role of video, reflections and guidance. And we also hosted, for example, a public event bringing together American and Brazilian documenters and cop watchers to share their experience. So through this process of listening to many people involved in this work, we identified a gap in accessible guidance on how people can safely, ethically, and effectively document police abuse, and also a need to support grassroots groups with the collecting, organizing, archiving, and sharing of large amounts of video footage that could expose broader systemic patterns of abuse and how that can be used to support communities to tell their own stories. So, for the rest of the presentation, before I talk about the collaborations, I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Jackie Zamudo, who manages our US program and has really led the work with El Grito and Berkeley Copwatch. So starting from 2016 to 2018, we partnered with a Brooklyn-based community organization called El Grito to Sunset Park in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, to digitize, organize, preserve, and share a selection of their 20+ year history of footage depicting police violence in their community. And we created a web resource with them called Profiling the Police, which I'll discuss shortly. So we worked with them for 2 years, 2016 to 2018, and fast forward to today, with the help of archivist Robin Margolis. We're actually working with El Grito now to help them adapt and integrate a new database into their new reporting platform that was just released recently called Copwatch Media. Going back to 2018, at that point, building on the learnings that from our work with El Grito, we engaged another organization, Berkeley Copwatch, for another phase of our database and archive building initiative. Berkeley Copwatch is a community-based police monitoring group that has been filming police misconduct and serving as a hub for know your rights information for their community for 30 years. So through a series of in-person meetings, workshops, calls, work sessions, we co-developed a data model, database, and video archive workflow so that they could better track incidents and problematic officers in their community and preserve their audiovisual evidence. So you see here a photo, literally us designing the data model using paper and pieces of string taped to a wall. And that eventually became an actual living database. So from this, Berkeley Copwatch has been able to develop their strategic justice campaigns, including one that led to the resignation of an abusive officer in Berkeley. The work has also increased Berkeley Copwatch's visibility in the community and among other Copwatch groups, and led to increased participation in local legislation decisions as well. So as I mentioned, our collaborations with El Grito and Berkeley Copwatch have yielded shareable resources that can be tailored and adapted to serve groups working to expose police violence worldwide. So the Profiling the Police resource I mentioned earlier is a website and a toolkit that we created with El Grito. And you can see here in this screenshot of the website on the left, founder Dennis Flores depicted in the video. So this website documented and demoed our exploration we did together into how their collections of video footage of police abuse could be analyzed, curated, and used to tell the stories from the community. We also documented our collaborative process for conceiving the project, for wading through a lot of video footage, for digitizing older materials. So here you see a screenshot of our workflow for digitizing mini DV tapes and also for cataloging. With Berkeley Copwatch, we developed a more elaborated database model and workflow. And these resources are available on a website called People's Database for Police Accountability, where you can find a Q&A, training slides, instructional video, detailed data model diagrams, a data dictionary and controlled vocabulary, and a downloadable FileMaker database template that you can just download and use. So since that last year, as I mentioned, we published the Berkeley Copwatch resources, and we've renewed our relationship with El Grito. And together with Berkeley Copwatch, we've hosted a series of webinars to train other Copwatchers in the methodology, and also have offered tailored one-on-one consultations with interested Copwatch groups. And then wherever possible, we've also offered microgrants to enable the sustainability and growth of these initiatives. And we've also been sharing our resources with other networks who are developing their own databases and archives. And of course, there are many challenges and a lot of learning as we go. And I'll just briefly allude to some of those ongoing challenges here, but I think we'll be talking about them a bit more in the Q&A as well. But the big ones are sustainability. Sustaining these initiatives is always a challenge. Another challenge is reaching and engaging the other activists and groups who might want to use our learnings and resources that we've developed. And then, making sure that the resources that we have are accessible and can meet people where they are, understanding, all those constraints of capacity and resources, especially with community-based volunteer-run organizations. So that is it for me. So I will stop sharing my screen and looking forward to the discussion with Renee, Jen, and Amanda.
Thank you so much, all three of you. All of those presentations were incredible and fascinating, and I probably speak for most folks here, and I said I'm really excited to learn about them and to ask some questions. Just before we start the Q&A, as a heads up, I realize we are running a little behind time. It's about 5 to 10. What we're thinking of doing is extending the Q&A period to about 10:10, hoping that that's okay with everyone. And yeah, so there's a few questions that are appearing in the Whova app. Some of them are for individual panelists and some are for all three. So I think that we'll start off with the question that's been posed to all of you. And so that question observes that for all of these projects, there's an element that will expose participants and collaborators to threats against personal safety. How do you mitigate or manage this? And I can drop it in the chat as well for everyone to see. not sure if there's someone, if you want to take a minute to think on it, or if there's someone who wants to speak to that first.
I can jump in quickly and just to get the conversation started. As a university researcher, I have an ethics protocol that is approved by Western University. And now that the project is growing, of course, we're integrating protocols across the universities, but also working on a process for protocols with partners in El Salvador that don't usually use them, including the universities there and the partner organizations. So there is information and consent forms that we use in our process. What has been interesting is that most of the survivors who share their testimonies, which is a large population that we work with, they want their names attached to their stories. So obviously, if they're creating a video testimony, they're identifiable. And I would say this is 98% of our participants, or 99% of our participants really want their names connected to their own stories. It's tremendously important for them. And early on in the project, we had to work with Western in order to provide this possibility. And it's not very often that participants want to be made confidential in what we're doing. I think the war ended in 1992. There are other kinds of threats in El Salvador now that are related to gang violence, and I think this is really the preoccupation of people in those territories, and also violence against environmental activists as well. In terms of the civil war, yes, there's a lot of political conflict that is ongoing, but not usually violent conflict.
I can go next, Jen, if you want to have some more time to think on it. I mean, just with El Grito and Berkeley Copwatch, as partner organizations, they are very aware of the security risk to themselves, and we're aware of them before they've been doing this for 20, 30 years, and so they've dealt with those risks and have accepted them. In terms of like the data within the databases, there are sort of important, I think, choice points that can be made throughout the process. So, for instance, like, first of all, being very clear about what you will collect and what you don't collect, and what you are able to take responsibility for holding on to, and being realistic about what you can't do. With this database, the focus is on the behavior of the police officers. It's not so much about collecting data about people in the community. There's a decision point about whether the databases should be hosted in the cloud or online or offline. So with Berkeley Copwatch, the database is completely offline. You can't it lives on a single computer. You can't access it without access to that computer. And that's based on a risk assessment. It depends on what the threat model is in every situation. We also basic things like having individual logins and passwords, different privilege sets for different types of users with data that's restricted. And these databases are not public, and they're not ever meant to be fully public. And they exist for the groups to use that information and maybe could make some portions of that data public, but the databases themselves are not.
Yvonne brought up a lot of things there that are remarkably similar. And I think I mentioned one of the tensions that we have is, collectivity of information versus the privacy and security. And, this project's not very old. So as it started off, it was completely offline in the jungle. It would be very hard for an infiltrator to access the knowledge off of the computers in Deep Guarani territory. But as more and more different communities are getting access, and we post more and more training online, it's something that we're definitely have been digging into. In fact, we've currently got a research project on security, specifically because we have partners in Brazil and Southeast Asia, where the governments are, well, I think a little bit about how horrific it is for activists there. We have to really think through the technical aspects of the protocol of Mapeo sync processes. Do we need administrators? Do we have to hide information? Do we have to start creating different kinds of sync profiles to acknowledge that? So we're right in the middle of that at this moment. But there's also some kind of built-in features. So synchronization shares the database, but there's also outputs. So from the desktop point of view, you can export your GeoJSON or your CSV files to be able to process, filter, edit, and then deliver to whatever audience you choose. And from mobile, you can actually do a share of an individual alert. So if there's a spill and you want to share it with a journalist, you don't have to share the database. You can just hit share, hit WhatsApp or email, and send off the photos and all the details that you've documented. So that's one of the kind of internal things. But the biggest part, I think, is what Yvonne was talking about, which really is human protocols. And every community is going to have to think through what that means and how to enable that and how to train people to use it.
Yeah, thank you so much for those. Yeah, and there's a question in the Q&A here in Zoom, Jen, I think is kind of overlaps with a bit of what you were just talking about. So I'll add it in the chat here, but if you want to expand on any of those points to answer that, and just for everyone, I'm dropping that question in the chat, and it's specifically a question asking about how logistics are organized between pods to stay up to date.
Yeah. And so maybe I'll kind of answer. I think Grant had mentioned the question about how synchronization is actually handled in the back end. There's actually a specific technical protocol called Mapeo Core, which is underneath the two tools that have the interfaces that people interact with. So there's that backend technology that we're working on, but on the front end, it really does depend on community to community. So for example, in the case of the Guarani territory mapping, they have a mapping team. They have trained specific people in that team to be able to circulate. They make sure they go through a really stringent process of consulting a community whether they are comfortable with sharing that information with the territory or not. And describing in depth some of the vulnerabilities of that and before they start engaging, which is why the territory hasn't been completely mapped yet. And in the case of their using their map data to win a court case against the Ecuadorian government, that wasn't the raw data. They filtered out all the sacred site data. They filtered out any of the information that could have been used against them by the government or industries in these other outputs. So it takes a little bit of extra technical work to be able to access some of these functionalities, but it really does, I think, the technology right now is a little bit analog enough for it to get through, but as soon as we start introducing a web sync process, which we're working on right now, we're really digging into these privacy protocols and what we need to set in place before we launch Mapeo web sync to the world, because people are asking for it, but we know how heavy of a decision that really is.
All right, thank you so much. There's another question coming in from the Whova app, and this one's for Yvonne, and this is asking, have you worked with the journalism community in developing and distributing resources? And I'll drop that in the chat as well.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I guess the short answer is yes, certainly we have, not just with these projects, but, with Witness as a whole and all of our programs. We work with grassroots. In a way, we're almost like a sort of intermediary organization in that we work with grassroots, organizations, but also with lawyers, journalists, international organizations and other NGOs, and we try to make those connections. And network building is a big part of what we do. And yeah, we certainly work with journalists, part of coalition with journalists. Share, adaptive resources developed by journalists, for instance, work that journalists have done on vicarious trauma and those kinds of issues. Yeah.
Thank you. There's another question from the Whova app. This one's for Amanda. And so this question is specifically asking about protest songs. So it's asking, are protest songs prominent in Salvadoran memory? And if so, are they being preserved as a part of various community initiatives and memory projects?
Yeah, so I can speak generally to this question. One of our co-applicants is Dr. Emily Ansari, who's a music historian at Western University, one of my colleagues, and she has been working on the project since the beginning. We have a mix of songs that include protest songs, but also what I would call kind of testimonial songs. It's kind of an interesting background story because a colleague we were working with in the US gave us a bunch of audio files that had been like circulating in the Salvadorian studies academic community in the United States for years. The files had names, Norberto Amaya, and then the names of the songs. And when we did our first historical memory workshops, like nobody knew who, on the team and in this group, nobody knew who Norberto Amaya was. They didn't know where these songs had, originated. It seemed that they were recorded in the refugee camps. And on the third day of our first pilot refugee memory workshops in the community of Milingo, his daughter showed up at the workshop to participate in the discussions. And she said, I live down the road with my father, with Norberto Amaya. He's still alive in his 80s. And he didn't have copies of these songs that had been circulating among scholars. And so we brought the songs back to him. We actually made a documentary film about him that you can see on our website, about him, but also with him and with his family, in which he listens to the songs and interprets the lyrics for us. So this was sort of the beginnings of the music archive, was Norberto Amaya's songs, which are testimonies to the refugee experience and to the popular struggle in the mountains of Chalatenango with the guerrilla forces. But it has expanded, so it includes those songs, but also contemporary performances of those songs. And we've developed a database that isn't live yet, which is interactive. So people can upload songs from their communities, performances of songs they remember. It's also a topic in our memory workshops as well. And Felipe Tobar, who you saw in the video that I showed you, is also a songwriter. So he writes songs about the various massacres in Chalatenango. And so we're also preserving those songs as well. So yes, there are protest songs, but a lot of testimonies about massacres, about refugee experiences and wartime experiences. And you can see more in our documentary film about Norberto Amaya.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, when I've been reading into your project, Amanda, it's fascinating tracing the return of records that are documenting communities to those communities, but also returning the materials that were created by those communities and have been held by Northern researchers to them. So thank you. And got another question for Yvonne, and I'll drop it in the chat. So this is coming from the Whova app. And it's saying, it looks like the records are to be preserved in the cloud and controlled by community groups. I think you've spoken about this a bit. So it's asking, are there any plans to deposit materials to traditional archives, perhaps one specializing in human rights, like the Blinken Open Society archives?
Sorry again. I might not be understanding the question exactly. I mean, with all of our partnerships, I mean, where we're supporting the archiving, we're not collecting the records from the groups, but we're supporting the groups to archive their own collections. So whether they end up using cloud storage or local storage, I mean, in the two instances that I'm talking about, they're not storing their content on the cloud. The idea is that these organizations are using those records in their everyday advocacy work, and so long-term considerations are important also, but the the main purpose is to make those records available now so that they can use it to push for the resignation of this police officer, for example. But for Witness's own archives, for example, we have records going back to the 1990s that really unique documentation, and we've partnered with a collecting institution in Malmö, Sweden, because we recognize that as a human rights organization, our priority is not that long-term preservation and scholarly access, and it's just not where we want to put our resources. And so those kinds of partnerships do make sense in certain situations.
Okay, thank you so much for that again. Yes, I think that we are at time. I just want to thank all three of you so much for taking the time and putting in the labor to share your work with us. This has been incredible. I see also Grant has dropped a message in the chat saying that before we close, I want to thank program team members Amanda Oliver, who's one of Amanda's collaborators, and Sharon Evans, who, I didn't know is a mentee of Yvonne's, for bringing these panelists to the conference, and additionally for Yvonne for suggesting Jen to join the panel too. So a lot of thanks all around. Yeah, thank you so much. And as a reminder, if folks want to continue adding questions in the app to Whova, we can continue this conversation after. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you, everyone. Amazing presentations.
Thanks, everyone. This was a really great experience.